Welcome to another episode of the Battlefields Bourbon Podcast, where we sit and sip, talk all things Civil War history and bourbon whiskey. I'm Jack, joined as always by my co-host Elijah, and we are coming to you from the beautiful Bell House in historic downtown Winchester, Virginia, which is preserved and maintained by the Shenandoah Valley Battlefields Foundation, the Battlefields Bourbon Podcast official sponsor. Well, we've got an interesting topic this evening, something that's a little more different than the other things we've talked about here in the series of episodes we have done. But before we get into that, Elijah, introduce us to our bourbon.
So tonight's pour is going to be Penelope Bourbon. This is their 4-grain expression. So this one's got corn, rye, wheat, and malted barley. I'm assuming in that order as far as the percentages go. Bottled at 80 proof, so your bare minimum for bourbon, 80 proof. So that'll be a lighter, softer, more palatable bourbon, a good intro for those who aren't looking for something higher proof, as we tend to have done in recent episodes. But the Penelope brand, they're sourced from MGP, so out in Lawrenceburg, Indiana, the MGP distillery. They do a lot of sourcing for up-and-coming brands, Penelope being one of them. And it says on the label here, bottled by Penelope Bourbon Bottling Company in Bardstown, Kentucky. But I'm pretty sure they are based out of New Jersey.
Okay.
Somebody will clarify that if I'm wrong. But here on the back of the label, kind of gives you a little backstory into the brand and what they're about. But it says that it's named after the founder's daughter, Penelope. So nice little family tie there for them. But this is their signature 4-grain bourbon, and they say that it is blended from 3 bourbon mash bills. So you've got
Just a blended bourbon.
More or less, you got different batches and stuff that come together to make your whiskey there. But it's interesting that they've got 3 different recipes in one to make that 4-grain.
Yeah.
So I'm not sure if that one mash bill has all 4 grains, or if each recipe has different. It's
higher in that one mash than in
so
that one grain.
Right. So like if there's a mash bill that's just corn, rye, malted barley, corn, wheat, malted barley, like,
something
and
like
they
that.
all come together to make the 4-grain. I'd be interested to learn more about that if that's the case. But yeah, they do a lot of different things. I know here recently in Virginia, at least, they dropped the Penelope Rio, which is one of their more sought after releases, higher proof. And I'm not sure what all goes into that because I've never tried it, so I haven't really looked into it myself. But I know it's pretty highly sought after. If we ever get it on an episode one day, we'll be able to give our thoughts on it a little better, but we can give this one a little cork pop and see what we think here.
Oh, good pop.
I knew it was going to be a good one. I knew that one was going to be good.
Yeah, this was a gift to me for Christmas by my good friend Chris, former podcast host of a different podcast. But
Shout out, Chris.
Shout out, Chris. Very excited for this one. Another fun fact, I used to own a cow. I've only owned one animal. Well, I've owned a couple livestock animals in my life. I owned a heifer, Black Angus, or I think she was a mix of an Angus, and her name was Penelope. I named her.
Really?
Yeah. Penelope.
So it all comes full circle.
Yeah.
Whether it be livestock or bourbon.
Yeah.
But, yeah, this one on the nose is like, do you get the apple on that one? I know you had mentioned that with Elijah Craig way back when.
Yeah. A little bit of that green apple, Granny Smith type of.
Yeah, 100% there. And I think it even says so on the back of the label here, because they give you the nose and tasting notes and everything. Aromas of sweet buttercream and fresh apples. Definitely pick that up. Married with layers of nutmeg and allspice. If you're not sure what allspice is, I'm pretty sure that just means like baking spices of any kind. So that way it's like just kind of covers your bases there and you don't have to list them all individually. Palate is a creamy, sweet dance of almonds and vanilla bean that finishes with hints of toasted macadamia nuts and a subtle kiss of tangerine citrus.
There's a lot going on there.
Yeah, and as far as age statement goes, it says aged a minimum of 26 months. So not a specific age there, just that it's a minimum of 2 years, 2 months. So yeah,
I've already tasted it.
I haven't yet. I've been.
This is your first time trying Penelope, right?
Yeah, first time.
Exciting.
Very light. You can definitely tell it's an 80 proof.
Yeah, it's light. I definitely get the creamy, like the creaminess of it.
Good mouthfeel. Very soft.
It's a good bourbon.
Yeah, no, for an intro, like if you're just getting into Penelope's products and stuff and you're trying to start at the low end and work your way up, that's definitely a great bottle. I'm not sure what the retail is on it because obviously we didn't buy it.
Yeah, it was a gift, so let's just hope all your Penelope bottles are gifts if you're trying to find one.
From what I've seen, from what I recollect, because I haven't been into an ABC in a good while now, the prices on them are pretty fair. I mean, as you climb the ladder, obviously they're going to get a little more expensive just because you're getting a higher quality product, so to speak. But this one, I can't imagine is more than $40 or $50 if I had to guess off the top of my head.
I think because of its proof, and I'm sure the other elements of the mash bill or whatever it is, definitely get that vanilla, like creamy sweetness.
Mm-hmm.
Not too much of like spices or the earthiness of the oak when you have like a more aged bourbon. This is, very sweet, very light.
Candy-like almost.
And not like, if it was a younger or a lighter bourbon, I would expect something more of like that hard-hitting, you're going to get that alcohol
Smoky,
burn.
earthy.
Yeah. And I don't get any of that.
Yeah.
It's very smooth. But again, it's 80 proof, so.
Yeah. It'd be a good dessert bourbon, honestly.
Yeah,
It's got a nice,
for sure,
that sweetness to it.
This with like a slice of cheesecake or something.
Man.
Yeah.
You're going to make me hungry and the episode hasn't
cheesecake
even started yet.
Or like a nice creme brulee. Ooh, like something more vanilla-y in flavor.
Bread pudding, but that's just my bias. That's like my favorite dessert.
Yeah, no, that's something like that. This is a very light, it's a good one. It's a nice sipping one.
Yeah, those flavors all go together really well.
So you said they have some other ones. You said the Rio.
They've got quite a lot of different expressions, and that's what I appreciate about the brand, is we've got so many that we can put on the episodes to come. They've got that. They've got Penelope Architect. There's a Valencia orange wine finished that I really want to try because I'm a big orange guy. I love orange stuff, so that I think will be a really good one to try if we can get it. The Rio, like I mentioned. And there's a good handful of other ones, barrel strength. There's quite a lot of expressions from them, so no shortage of stuff to try in the future. But for what we've got here, this is really impressive. But yeah. As far as that goes, that's Penelope bourbon in a nutshell. At least their entry level stuff. Yeah,
no, this is a really good bourbon, and I'd recommend this to anybody that's looking to grab another bottle and hasn't tried Penelope yet. It's really good.
Very easy drinking too.
Yeah. So far, have we had a bad bourbon yet?
Not that I know of. Maybe some that I would probably not care to buy again.
Yeah, for sure. But there's a lot of ones on here that we've had where I'm like, well, it's been able to help educate me on my palate and what else I can try, but and what I do like and don't like. But I feel like
horizons.
I feel like a lot of these are pretty good. I'm sure we'll broaden out and we'll buy some crappy ones on purpose.
Yeah.
They're supposedly crappies, and then I'll give my honest opinion.
Surprising, yeah. The only one I think personally that I disliked, if we're on that topic.
We're on it. Yeah. Go in.
Only one that I've like really, not that I disliked it, but that I wouldn't care to buy it again would be Traveler whiskey. And that's no jab at Buffalo Trace because obviously their reputation speaks for itself. But I just think that it was okay.
No jab at Stapleton too.
No.
Big fan, right?
Yeah, big fan of Stapleton.
We'll have him on the pod if he ever wants to come on.
Yeah, he's more than welcome anytime. But I don't know. I think it could have been. I was expecting bourbon, and it's. I've come to find out, I got a good proportion of Canadian whiskey in the blend.
Oh, really?
Yeah, and it's not that I dislike that, but you can taste it, and it's not what I was expecting. I was expecting more of like a bourbon taste, and it's not bourbon. That's why they obviously call it whiskey, a blended whiskey.
So I looked it up. He's not entirely sober. So I think you said in the episode.
I think I saw that too. Yeah.
Yeah, we thought he was like completely sober. Like the guy probably never tasted his whiskey. It's not true. Interview January 21st, 2024. Chris Stapleton says he's cut back on his drinking, but hasn't quit entirely. So it's safe to say he has tried that. Yeah, and they call it's a bourbon, right? I mean, it is a.
No, they call it a blended whiskey.
Blended whiskey. So yeah, I mean that's what we're gonna get. We're used to our bourbon taste.
Yeah.
We have an expectation, but as we've seen in other whiskeys we've drank on the podcast, we've had rye whiskeys, other types of whiskeys. So just that probably wasn't the top one. Like I'm a big fan of, what did we try? The Ragnarok rye from
that was killer.
Catoctin Creek over in Northern Virginia. That was really good. I've come to learn I like rye, but blended whiskeys, like you said, you
got to know what you're getting yourself into. You got to know what to expect going into it. Like you can't expect a blended 90 proof whiskey to knock your socks off. You know what I mean? It's
true.
Not going to be,
and it's a celebrity whiskey. So with that, you got to take a couple points off because
it's a premium type of thing.
Yeah,
it's not going to be like your Pappy Van Winkle or your Old Fitzgerald or something that's like the cream of the crop as far as bourbon is concerned. Yeah. But that's okay because not everything is supposed to be like that.
That's
true. If everything were like that, we wouldn't be able to have any of this on the podcast because we'd never be able to find it. So
that's true.
Yeah.
Well, we've got a good drink and good pour in our glass right now. And Elijah, if you kind of want to set us up for what the topic is today.
Yeah. So full disclosure for anybody who is a little squeamish, perhaps combat veterans, anybody that might get triggered by violence. Our topic of discussion this evening or today is going to be based around the excerpts of a Union soldier, Frank Wilkerson, and it's a chapter out of his book or memoirs, Recollections of a Private Soldier in the Army of the Potomac. The chapter is How Men Die in Battle. So as you can imagine, that's going to be a touchy subject for some, and it does, as we'll get into it, go into pretty good detail as far as that's concerned with him witnessing soldiers dying in battle. And obviously that's not something that everybody would care to listen to. If you've gotten your fix from the podcast of just listening to us talk about bourbon.
And now's a good time to click off if you don't do well with listening to very graphic and gory descriptions of death or wounding. Even though this happened 160 years ago.
It still happened. It's still real.
Yeah, wars are still affecting people and have affected people's lives, so we take that very seriously. So this is our trigger warning for folks out there. We are going to get into it. We're not going to really censor much as we read this chapter. And that's what we're going to do. We're going to, like Elijah said, we're going to read, because we thought if anyone, everyone can study a battle or go to a battlefield and read a book or what have you, but not often are people, an average person trying to study the war is going to go to those firsthand accounts. They're going to read a book that has, footnotes that include excerpts from a diary or something like that. But this is written by a man that witnessed it, and this is exactly what he witnessed. So he does not shy away from what he saw. And if, there's tons of stories, and we'll share them at the end of the episode, of specific individuals' descriptions and experiences with death and dying. But this we thought would be really well when it came to covering someone's full experience and just, getting a broad view, but very specific view to capture almost every aspect of someone's death caused by the conflict itself. Tons of people died from disease and other things, but when it comes to the lead flying across a battlefield, this description really sums up the different ways that people could have, passed on into the ether.
And I think this is a good way to bridge that gap because I've said this before in another episode, I think. The Civil War, obviously being so long ago as it was, for some it can kind of become one of those distant memories to where casualty reports and folks dying and that kind of thing, they just become numbers on paper.
Numbers on paper.
Because you look at it in the grand scheme of things and you just see this number of casualties at this battle or what have you.
Yeah.
And you're not really thinking about each individual soldier that makes up that casualty report, how they died. And Frank Wilkerson does a great job in his memoirs of describing that so that way the reality of war kind of sets in. And hopefully this is something that people can learn from, obviously. As a way of, learning from history, just as it's meant to do. It's supposed to teach you, not to repeat it.
Yeah, and for reflection, for remembrance. And we think this would be a good episode as we get close to what is this? This will be episode 18, 19?
18. Yep.
18 as we close to 20 episodes and all the different people, regiments, battles we've talked about. This will be a good episode for folks to kind of, as you're coming along this journey with us, to take a moment, pause, reflect on the true sacrifice and the true outcome of these, things we talk about for an hour or so. This is, as real as it gets. So like we said, if you cannot do, gory, very descriptive accounts of death and dying and things like that, if you're not an avid Dateline listener or you work in law, it's click off now. But if you want to educate yourself and humble yourself a little bit and just come to the realization of what these statistics, these numbers that end up, on a sheet or a number you read at the end of a book or something to, sum up a blimp in the radar that is the Civil War, this will help dive a little bit deeper into that. So for the next couple minutes, we will be reading and dissecting and reacting to Frank Wilkerson's chapter on How Men Die in Battle.
Yeah, and he kicks off this chapter very to the point, I think. He says that almost every death on the battlefield is different, and the manner of the death depends on the wound and on the man, whether he is cowardly or brave, whether his vitality is large or small, whether he's a man of active imagination or is dull of intellect, whether he is of nervous or lymphatic temperament. I instance deaths and wounds that I saw in Grant's last campaign. So these are specific to the latter end of the war.
Yeah, the 64 Overland campaign.
Yeah, I think, and he mentions I think it begins from the wilderness onward.
So the beginning of the campaign almost to its end.
Yep. But this is kind of what he saw firsthand. There's nothing here that's made up. This is all real.
Yeah. He continues, on the second day of the Battle of the Wilderness, where I fought as an infantry soldier, I saw more men killed and wounded than I did before or after in that same time. I knew but few of the men in the regiment in whose ranks I stood, but I learned the Christian names of some of them. The man who stood next to me on my right was called Will. He was cool, brave, intelligent. In the morning when the Second Corps was advancing and driving Hill's soldiers slowly back, I was flurried. He noticed it and steadied my nerves by saying kindly, "Don't fire so fast. This fight will last all day. Don't hurry. Cover your man before you pull your trigger. Take it easy. My boy, take it easy, and your cartridges will last longer." This man fought effectively. During the day, I had learned to look up to this excellent soldier and lean on him. Toward the evening, as we were being slowly driven back to the Brock Road by Longstreet's men, we made a stand. I was behind a tree firing, with my rifle barrel resting on the stub of a limb. Will was standing by my side, but in the open. He, with a groan, doubled up and dropped on the ground at my feet. He looked up at me. His face was pale. He gasped for breath a few times and then said faintly, "That ends me. I'm shot through the bowels." I said, "Crawl to the rear. We are not far from the entrenchments along the back road." I saw him sit up and indistinctively saw him reach for his rifle, which had fallen from his hands as he fell. Again I spoke to him, urging him to go to the rear. He looked at me and said impatiently, "I tell you that I am good as dead. There is no use in fooling with me. I shall stay here." Then he pitched forward dead, shot again through the head. We fell back before Longstreet's soldiers and left Will lying in the windrow of dead men.
And that's something that I've always noticed as far as Civil War deaths are concerned. I think it's just a 19th century attitude, is that these men are comfortable with the fact or the reality of death. I know you see depicted in modern films and stuff like that, people freaking out and just, and I'm sure that happened then as well, just the reality of it setting in. But some of these men are just so comfortable with what fate has bestowed upon them, as just the fact that this is it. I'm comfortable with that. I know where I'm at.
Yeah, but both you and I have never experienced this, but I'm sure there's folks in law enforcement or in military backgrounds, whatever the case may be, where there's the snap of your finger, and this is just my assumption. I'm sure we could have folks on to say otherwise, but my assumption is that, when you're in that moment, your adrenaline's pumping, there's other thoughts going on, but in that moment, it is the fight or flight. It's your natural instincts taking over. And the idea of death isn't as scary as it is when you're, at home. It's different when it's there and you have full control of what you can do. Death's just something that will come if it comes.
Yeah.
And that's just my assumption with it. But I think that's why you see so many examples of soldiers, especially in the Civil War, that are very comfortable, can confront death. And we'll cover some of those more accounts at the end of the episode. But yeah, that's just an interesting take.
Mm-hmm. And then he goes on to say that when we got into the Brock Road entrenchments, a man a few files to my left dropped dead, shot just above the right eye. He did not groan or sigh or make the slightest physical movement except that his chest heaved a few times. The life went out of his face instantly, leaving it without a particle of expression. It was plastic, and as the facial muscles contracted, it took many shapes. When this man's body became cold and his face hardened, it was horribly distorted, as though he had suffered intensely. Any person who had not seen him killed would have said that he had endured supreme agony before death released him. A few minutes after he fell, another man, a little further to the left, fell with apparently a precisely similar wound. He was straightened out and lived for over an hour. He did not speak, simply lay on his back. His broad chest rose and fell, slowly at first, and then faster and faster, and more feebly, until he was dead. And his face hardened, and it was almost terrifying in its painful distortion. I have seen dead soldiers' faces, which were wreathed in smiles, and heard their comrades say that they had died happy. I do not believe that the face of a dead soldier lying on the battlefield ever truthfully indicates the mental or physical anguish or peacefulness of mind which he suffered or enjoyed before his death. The face is plastic after death, and as the facial muscles cool and contract, they draw the face into many shapes. Sometimes the dead smile, again they stare with glassy eyes and lolling tongues, and dreadfully distorted visages at you. It goes for nothing. One death was as painless as the other.
Yeah, and I think through that one, when you were reading that one, and when I've read this before, makes me think of a lot of those images that come out of Antietam, and Sharpsburg, and those first images of the dead and dying, and especially the images that come out of Gettysburg too. Whether they're staged or not, those men in those images are dead, and they're probably not going to stage too much with their face, obviously. So those faces you see are those kind of what he's describing here, where the faces are plastic, and it's just something you don't think about. But obviously, once he describes it, because it's what he witnessed, it's it'll finally open your eyes to those, when you'll look at those images of Antietam or Gettysburg a little bit differently, I think.
And you hear a lot of accounts from the war of soldiers dying with a smile on their face and that sort of thing, and that may not always be that they died happy. I don't think that very many men could die happily in war. I just don't think, me personally, I don't think that's possible. And it's probably due to the fact that he's recounting. When you die, I'm sure you're in such a way, it's probably causing your nervous system or your muscles to contract in ways that would put it in such an expression. And it just turns out that way. And it's just kind of one of those things that, not that it makes you laugh, but it's one of those weird instances. It's like, oh, he's smiling on the battlefield. How ironic.
Yeah.
It just is the way that it is, unfortunately.
Yeah. He continues here. After Longstreet's soldiers had driven the Second Corps into their entrenchments along the Brock Road, a battle-exhausted infantryman stood behind a large oak tree. His back rested against it. He was very tired, and he held his rifle loosely in his hand. The Confederates were directly in our front. This soldier was apparently in perfect safety. A solid shot from a Confederate gun struck the large oak tree squarely about 4 feet from the ground, but it did not have sufficient force to tear through the tough wood. The soldier fell dead. There was not a scratch on him. He was killed by the concussion.
This one part, and I know I've read this chapter numerous times, it has always amazed me because it's just you normally think of soldiers dying in battle being pierced by a bullet or an artillery shell fragment or
cut down by a sword, something like that.
Yeah, something where there is actual, battle
body damage.
Yeah. Not just being, a solid shot. For those that don't know, just a solid cannonball. It's not an explosive shell. They're meant to cut down trees, buildings, artillery, whatever the case may be. Just bounced off the ground or probably hit it directly low enough on the tree to where it would just reverberate really, really hard to cause that concussion. And it's just insane that had enough force to it to just concuss him to the point where it killed him immediately.
Yeah, I mean, if he's up against that tree, that cannonball is flying so fast, and if it stops into something, the motion of that will continue into whatever, through that tree, and if something's on the other side, it'll continue, and that's probably what happened. There's one account, I don't know if we talked about it in episode 1 with 2nd Winchester, but in Starfort, there's an account by the gentleman in the Baltimore Light Artillery. Those were the artillerists in Starfort, saying that as one guy's working the guns on the earthwork, Confederate round flew by him, didn't touch him, and knocked him out and injured him. And that was just because of the force, the concussion. I think he says in the account specifically, takes him out, and no bodily harm done to him.
Yeah, I mean, it's insane to think about the ballistics of that era and what they play as far as, injuring or maiming or killing a soldier without ever actually hitting them. And I think even in, this may have been Stonewall Jackson. I think he may have written about his time in Mexico as far as solid shots are concerned. Talking about soldiers seeing the Mexican artillery or solid shots skipping across the ground.
Yeah.
And they look like they're rolling so slow and just, I can reach out and stop a ball just to, just for fun. And he had mentioned a soldier reaching out for that very thing. He thought he could just, reach out, grab the ball and stop it, and ended up reaching out for it, and it took his arm off.
Yeah.
Just from his hand, pulled his arm clean off his body. And it's one of those things that you don't think about unless somebody mentions it in their experiences of the war. Otherwise, you just think everyone's being shot or blown apart or whatever the case is. And there are some really crazy anomalies in war that you can't imagine. You can't make it up.
Yeah,
is I guess what I'm getting at. You just can't make that stuff up.
Yeah.
But as he goes on to say in this chapter, he says, while we were fighting savagely over these entrenchments, and the woods in our front caught fire, and I saw many of our wounded burned to death. And I know that's something that is very well known as far as the wilderness is concerned, is the fire that caused many casualties there.
Or finished off a lot of wounded men, yeah.
Mm-hmm. He says, must they not have suffered horribly? I am not all sure of that. The smoke rolled heavily and slowly before the fire. It enveloped the wounded, and I think that by far the larger portion of the men who were roasted were suffocated before the flames curled round them. So this is a good first-hand account where people tend to think that maybe they burned to death and they suffered. They were probably out unconscious from the smoke.
I mean, it did happen, because there are accounts of those guys screaming, once the fire, but it's,
So, yeah, some were probably more fortunate than others to have been knocked unconscious by, smoke inhalation. I mean, if you consider that fortunate.
Yeah, and I've researched a lot of, the events of September 11th, and you hear about the folks in the World Trade Centers and those ones that were fortunate, with quotes, nothing about that is fortunate, but the ones that couldn't get out, the idea that the smoke took them out before any fire or building collapse, it's like one hand in the other.
A more peaceful death,
if
you had to choose. But he said the spectacle was courage-sapping and pitiful, which I imagine it was, and it appealed strongly to the imagination of the spectators, but I do not believe that the wounded soldiers who were being burned suffered greatly, if they suffered at all. So, it brings peace of mind to know that some of the ones that obviously weren't screaming during the flames were probably, they didn't know what was happening to them, which, that's something that everybody would, I think, hope for if they had to choose their death, is that you don't suffer.
Yeah. Yeah, he continues here, wounded soldiers, it mattered not how slight the wounds, generally hastened away from the battle lines. A wound entitled a man to go to the rear and to the hospital. Of course, there were many exceptions to this rule, as there would necessarily be in battles where from 20,000 to 30,000 men were wounded. I frequently saw slightly wounded men who were marching with their colors. I personally saw but 2 men wounded who continued to fight. During the first days fighting in the wilderness, I saw a youth of about 20 years skip and yell. Stung by a bullet through the thigh, he turned to limp to the rear. After he had gone a few steps, he stopped, then kicked out his leg once or twice to see if it would work. Then he tore away the clothing from his leg so as to see the wound. He looked at it attentively for an instant, then kicked out his leg again, and then turned and took his place in the ranks and resumed firing. There was considerable disorder in the line, and the soldier moved to and fro, now a few feet to the right and now a few feet to the left. One of those movements brought me directly behind this wounded soldier.
Which is, I mean, that's one of those things that...
It's the adrenaline, I think.
The adrenaline, yeah.
He's like, okay, I can still move my leg. I'm fine. I'm here to do this. I'm here to fight. That's the adrenaline, I'm sure, there.
And you got to think, the adrenaline, as far as that goes, probably kicks in as you're marching towards the line of fire. I mean, your heart's probably pounding.
And I'm sure there's instances where soldiers don't even know they're wounded.
Don't even feel it.
Don't even feel it. Yeah.
And that's probably one of those cases there is he's probably testing his leg out because he knows he's wounded but doesn't feel it. And he's like, am I really okay? Yeah. May as well go back in line and start firing.
Yeah, he continues to talk about him here, Elijah.
He said, I could see plainly from that position, and I pushed into the gaping line and began firing. In a minute or two, the wounded soldier dropped his rifle and, clasping his left arm, exclaimed, I am hit again. He sat down behind the battle ranks and tore off the sleeve of his shirt. The wound was very slight, not much more than skin deep, so just a graze. He tied his handkerchief around it, picked up his rifle, and took position alongside of me. I said, you are fighting in bad luck today. You'd better get away from here. He turned his head to answer me. His head jerked. He staggered, then fell, then regained his feet. A tiny fountain of blood and teeth and bone and bits of tongue burst out of his mouth. He had been shot through the jaws. The lower one was broken and hung down. I looked directly into his open mouth, which was ragged and bloody and tongueless. He cast his rifle furiously on the ground and staggered off. So he was still alive at this point. He was more so just pissed off that because he stopped to speak to him, it cost him another injury.
Yeah, and there's accounts of guys like this that do survive, and a lot of faux jaws are made to help with just the idea of a face looking the same. Mm-hmm. Some just grow their beards longer to cover that up. It's crazy. He continues, the next day, just before Longstreet's soldiers made their first charge on the 2nd Corps, I had heard the peculiar cry a stricken man utters as the bullet tears through his flesh. I turned my head as I loaded my rifle to see who was hit. I saw a bearded Irishman pull up his shirt. He had been wounded in the left side, just below the floating ribs. His face was gray with fear. The wound looked as it were mortal. He looked at it for an instant, then poked it gently with his index finger. He flushed readily and smiled with satisfaction. He tucked his shirt into his trousers and was fighting in the ranks again before I had capped my rifle. The ball had cut a groove in his skin only. The play of this Irishman's face was so expressive, his emotions changed so quickly that I could not keep from laughing.
I mean, what a shift of emotions, right?
For him, you think that you're dead. Him too, yeah.
You think that you're dead one minute, and then you realize that you've been spared ever so slightly. But that's one of those things. I mean, it's like a humor in the face of death. It's just, you see it here.
Yeah.
But as they go on to say, he says, near Spotsylvania, I saw as my battery was moving into action a group of wounded men lying in the shade cast by some large oak trees. All of these men's faces were gray. They silently looked at us as we marched past them. One wounded man, a blond giant of about 40 years, was smoking a short briarwood pipe. He had a firm grip on the pipe stem. I asked him what he was doing. He said, having my last smoke, young fellow. His dauntless blue eyes met mine, and he bravely tried to smile. I saw that he was dying fast. Another of these wounded men was trying to read a letter. He was too weak to hold it, or maybe his sight was clouded. He thrust it unread into the breast pocket of his blouse and lay back with a moan. This group of wounded men numbered 15 or 20 15 or 20, not 50 or 20. At the time, I thought that all of them were fatally wounded, and that there was no use in the surgeons wasting time on them when men who could be saved were clamoring for their skillful attention. None of these soldiers cried aloud. None of them called on wife or mother or father. They lay on the ground, pale-faced and with set jaws, waiting for their end. They moaned and groaned as they suffered, but none of them flunked. Then, when my battery returned from the front 5 or 6 hours afterward, almost all of these men were dead. Long before the campaign was over, I concluded that dying soldiers seldom called on those who were dearest to them, seldom conjured their northern or southern homes until they became delirious. Then, when their minds wandered and fluttered at the approach of freedom, they babbled of their homes. Some were boys again, and were fishing in northern trout streams. Some were generals leading their men to victory. Some were with their wives and children. Some wandered over their family's homestead, but all, with rare exceptions, were delirious. And we'll get into that in a specific instance here later.
Yeah, I think that's a good description of, that right up to the death's door.
Mm-hmm.
He continues at the North Anna River, so we're continuing to the campaign. My battery being in action, an infantry soldier, one of our supports, who was lying face downward close behind the gun I served on, and in a place where he thought he was safe, was struck on the thighs by a large jagged piece of shell. The wound made by this fragment of iron was as horrible as any I saw in the army. The flesh of both thighs was torn off, exposing the bones. The soldier bled to death in a few minutes, and before he died, he conjured his northern home and murmured of his wife and children.
I mean, that's tough to imagine.
Yeah.
Just that kind of injury. But in that same battle, he says, but on the south side of the river, a man who carried a rifle was passing between the guns and caissons of the battery. A solid shot intended for us struck him on the side. His entire bowels were torn out and slung in ribbons and shreds on the ground. He fell dead, but his arms and legs jerked convulsively a few times. It was a sickening spectacle. During this battle, I saw a Union picket knocked down, probably by a rifle ball striking his head and glancing from it. He lay as though dead. Presently, he struggled to his feet with blood streaming from his head. He staggered aimlessly around and round in circles, as sheep afflicted with grubs in the brain do. Instantly, the Confederate sharpshooters opened fire on him and speedily killed him as he circled.
Yeah.
That's a kind of a mercy kill, I would say. I mean, it's sad to see, but it was coming.
Yeah, so we're almost to the end. We have one more paragraph, and we've almost seen all these different types of deaths that could take place during the war. Everything from concussion to mortal wounds to instant deaths to mercy kills, things like that. So he's describing a lot of different ways to die. And this is just one man's experience and description of it all. He concludes here with wounded soldiers almost always tore their clothing away from their wounds so as to see them and to judge of their character. Many of them would smile and their faces would brighten as they realized they were not hard hit and that they could go home for a few weeks. Others would give a quick glance at their wounds and then shrink back as from a blow and turn pale as they realized the truth that they were mortally wounded. The enlisted men were exceedingly accurate judges of the probable result which would ensure from any wound they saw. They had seen hundreds of soldiers wounded, and they had noticed that certain wounds always resulted fatally. They knew when they were fatally wounded, and after the shock of discovery had passed, they generally braced themselves and died in a manly manner. It was seldom that an American or Irish volunteer flunked in the presence of death.
That pretty much sums it up. I mean,
Yeah, and that is Frank Wilkerson's Union veteran description of how men die in battle. And we thought that was, critical and important for listeners to, give a few minutes to listen to one man's experience and how he witnessed death on this topic we're also fascinated with.
Yeah, I mean, that's something that you need to to understand, to fully appreciate the history of the war and the sacrifices that have been made, to be a student of the Civil War. It's one of those things that not everybody wants to hear about. It's kind of uncomfortable to talk about, but it's one of those things that happened. It's part of it, and it will eventually get discussed at some point or another. And as you had mentioned, where we would discuss at some point the specific instances aside from just this one man's recollections that kind of relate to this in terms of notable battle deaths.
Yeah, and only one of those men, Will, had a name out of the many deaths he talked about there. So we decided, Elijah and I decided to pick out a few that had names and some connections that we could relate to the podcast, as well as individuals who had pictures too. So as we post their stories leading up after this episode is released, it just helps bring a deeper connection to the meaning of this episode's topic. For sure. And another death on the battlefield that relates to what Mr. Wilkerson mentioned as he talked about delirium and just that kind of in and out state as death approaches. One that people will probably be pretty well acquainted with was General Stonewall Jackson's death, and instances of delirium as his final moments kind of closed. He was quoted as saying, as he's laying on his deathbed, of dying of pneumonia, not from the wounds that he received as a result of friendly fire from, reconnaissance scouting at Chancellorsville. He actually had pneumonia, and at this point was dying from it. Mm-hmm. He's in his final moments saying to bring up A.P. Hill's men as if he's hallucinating, thinking he's still on the front fighting a battle, and he's calling for Hill, and then just shifts to this peaceful quote that people will all remember, where he had said, "Let us cross over the river and rest under the shade of the trees." It's just, you go from one extreme to the realization of death in a matter of minutes, and then that's it. Yeah, I found some of the more specific. So as Jackson's laying there in Guinea Station, recovering from his wounds and his amputation of his, what was his left arm, I believe, mm-hmm. left arm. Elijah said contracts pneumonia. He says, and as he's dying, push up the columns, Pendleton. You take charge of that. Where's Pendleton? Tell him to push up the column. He continues, draw your sword and throw away your scabbard. Give them the bayonet. Kill them, sir. Kill every man. And then continues with, let me cross over the river and rest under the shade of the tree. Jackson, it just really sums up what the general became up until that point, and his faith as well as his loyalty to the state of Virginia and his role as a military leader truly shows in those last couple moments of his mm-hmm. life. One individual I wanted to bring up was one you all see on our episode pictures all the time, and that's the logo of the Shenandoah Valley Battlefields National Historic District. And that's normally in the corner of our episode picture. That individual you see in that logo is actually a person. That is Thomas Garland Jefferson, who was a VMI cadet killed at the Battle of Newmarket. He is the great grandnephew of Thomas Jefferson, so President of these here United States, former President of these here United States. And he but he enters the Virginia Military Institute at the age of 16 years old. He's born in 1857. And 1847, my bad. And as he joins there, he's a part of the 257 cadets that are called out by Confederate General John C. Breckinridge in May of 1864. And when Breckinridge gives the order, put the boys in, and may God forgive me for the order, Jefferson's a part of. He's part of that assault across the Bushong farmstead and towards Bushong's Hill. And when As the cadets made their charge, Jefferson was struck in the chest by a bullet and collapsed. Some of his classmates and comrades went over to help him, and he pointed to the front lines saying, "This is the place for you. You can do me no good." Fellow cadet and famous artist post-war Moses Ezekiel found Jefferson after the battle and found him lying on the floor of a hut. And he took him to the home of Lady Kleindienst, which is today the Krim House in downtown Newmarket, which is also preserved by the Shenandoah Valley Battlefields Foundation. There's a monument to Thomas Garland Jefferson there. And Lady Kleindienst writes an account of, as Thomas Garland Jefferson's still alive, she says, when we laid him down, he looked up at me and said, "Sister, what a good soft bed. Mother had an old-time feather bed, and it must have felt so soft to him after lying on that hard ground. He was about 16 years of age, was blue-eyed, and had golden hair. I will never forget him and his sweet, boyish face." Cadet Ezekiel, Moses Ezekiel, nursed him very tenderly. His own mother could not have done more for him. And she says the evening before he died, he called Cadet Ezekiel to read for him the 14th chapter of John. So John 14 reads, "Do not let your hearts be troubled. You believe in God. Believe also in me. My Father's house has many rooms. If that were not so, would I have told you that I am going there to prepare a place for you? And if I go and prepare a place for you, I will come back and take you to be with me, and that you also may be where I am. You know the way to the place where I am going." And that means a lot, when you're studying history and you're studying the Battle of Newmarket, especially these cadets, because Moses Ezekiel is a man of Jewish faith. He is a Jew, and he is the first Jewish cadet at the Virginia Military Institute, and he's reading from the Gospel of John. So not a book Moses and Moses Ezekiel in common religious practice would believe in, but in these dying moments, he reads this to put Thomas Garland Jefferson at ease. And he said in some words later to Lady Kleindienst, "I went to smooth his pillow, and he said," and this is Jefferson, "Sister, what beautiful hands." He called, "Duncan, come and light a candle. It is growing dark." The blindness of death came over him. And Thomas Garland Jefferson would die on May 18th in the arms of his classmate and fellow cadet Moses Ezekiel, and he'll be buried in the St. Matthew Cemetery churchyard there in Newmarket, and then later reinterred at the Newmarket Monument at Virginia in the post of Virginia Military Institute. So that's a little bit more history about that logo and who that individual was there, and it's just a compelling story because he's such a young boy, and there's such a great description, or a good description, of his last moments on his earth. So Elijah, is there another one you wanted to talk about?
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of similar to what you're discussing here, is a young man's death in battle, as you so often see during the Civil War. Is a lot of these soldiers fighting are, our age or younger. And it's just, I mean, it really ties you to the conflict when it's a reality for someone of your age, or, I mean, like I said, even younger, like when we were even in high school. And I'll give credit to our good friend Mike Robinson with Winchester Tales, because he did an excellent story on what I'm about to mention. And this is the death of Lieutenant Marshal Barton, one of 5 sons of the Barton family in the Shenandoah Valley that fought for the Confederate Army in the Stonewall Brigade. I think he's one of 3 of the 5 that died during the war. Only 2 actually survived.
Where was he? What regiment?
He was, I want to say, I think he was also in 2nd Virginia Infantry.
Okay.
I want to say.
I think that's right.
It may end up coming out here. But Mike writes that General Stonewall Jackson deployed his forces on the outskirts of Winchester on May 25th, 1862. So we're talking First Battle of Winchester here. In the area which is now the Meadow Branch neighborhood, he would push his men through the southern fields of Glen Burnie and attack near the water tower located near the John Kerr Elementary School. The First Battle of Winchester had begun. As the day progressed, 2 brothers who were born and raised in Winchester, Lieutenant David Barton and Lieutenant Marshall Barton, both in the Confederate artillery, so these would have been Rockbridge artillery then.
Okay, yeah.
Would find themselves moving quickly, repositioning their big guns to Bowers Hill. So for those of you that are familiar with our, local geography, that's the hill situated directly behind Hanley High School. They both knew these hills as they played on them as children. Now they found themselves in a life or death situation. They would wonder if their mother could hear the cannonade from their home at 126 North Cameron Street. They were sure she could. So yeah, the Bartons had two different homes, one at Springdale and then one here in town. As the day progressed.
And this 120, this is just a couple buildings away from where we're recording.
Pretty much
this
right next door to where
Yeah,
we're
right
sitting.
next door. They were neighbors to the Bells.
But as the day progressed, the Confederates would push General Banks's Federal Army off of Bowers Hill and get them running through the streets of Winchester. It was a complete Confederate victory. Winchester had been in the hands of the Federals since Jackson had retired before Banks's army in March at Kernstown, which, fittingly enough, Mike was our guest for that episode. And now General Banks had been driven out, and the flag of the Confederate Army flew once again over the town. From a porch on Cameron Street, Miss Barton would join the townspeople in cheering and waving to the boys in gray. There was also excitement and rejoicing within the columns, with bands playing and battle flags flying. A soldier dropped out of the line as the column passed the Barton house, and he rushed up to the steps and embraced and kissed Mrs. Barton. It was David Barton. He was so dirty, and so much gunpowder covered his face that his mother didn't recognize him. He bade farewell to his mother so he could catch up to his regiment. And this is what you'll hear here in a second. He didn't mention the details of the battle. As he passed a group of slaves on the sidewalk, he saw the woman who had raised him, who he affectionately called Mammy. Calling her aside, he said in a low voice, "Don't tell Mother now, but Marshall lies dead out on the battlefield." His voice trembled. "Please tell her later, as she is so happy now." Mammy stood stunned and shuffled into the house and went into the kitchen. She had raised all of the Barton boys as if they were her own. She was crushed. Only their mother loved them more than she. As Mammy sobbed in that empty kitchen on Cameron Street, she remembered the small, precious little boy that she used to carry in her arms. It would be told years later that Marshall was hit in the neck by a piece of shrapnel. This occurred somewhere on Bowers Hill near Tennyson Avenue. And that's as you would imagine, the Rockbridge artillery was probably facing heavy cannonade fire from the Federals, as that was the dominant position on the field of battle at that time for the artillery. So they're going to be trying to shell that as much as they could. And unfortunately, he was one of the ones that suffered as a result of that.
Yeah. And then got one more. We'll move a couple houses down on Cameron Street and stay in the same regiment
May as
here.
well.
So the Bells that lived in the house that we record in had many sons, many kids, two different marriages, and we'll get into that a different time. But one of the sons here at the Bell house was Robert Sherrard Bell Jr., and he was born in Winchester in 1840 and enlisted in the Rockbridge Artillery in November of 1861. He was captured at First Kernstown, so he would miss out on First Winchester, and was sent to a federal prison and then exchanged later in the fall of 1862, so after the Valley Campaign. He'll survive Chancellorsville, Gettysburg, Second Winchester, obviously, and then as the war and the army shift eastward to opposing sides of the Rappahannock and the Rapidan rivers, they'll be at Rappahannock Station, modern-day Remington, Virginia, and Robert Sherrard Bell will be there on picket duty, and he leaves a really good account in his diaries. That diary is on display at the Shenandoah Valley Civil War Museum, as well as his Bible. He leaves his last entry on Thursday, November 5th, and says it's windy, very disagreeable, and he's on picket duty at Rappahannock Bridge. That's his last diary entry because on November 7th, Robert Bell was struck by a large piece of artillery on Rappahannock Bridge, and a letter written to the Bells at this house was written by Corporal G. Newton Byers of the Rockbridge Artillery, and he'll say, from his company, Bob was struck while the battery was unengaged about 5 o'clock Saturday evening, November 7th. I did not know he had been struck until half an hour after it occurred, when someone coming up said, Private Bell has been killed. I immediately hastened to the spot where he was lying and make this accounting of his death. From what others and myself witnessed, when struck, he collapsed, Johnny Brown in his arms, exclaiming, I believe I am torn to pieces. Soon after he said, See how certain life is? A moment ago I was buoyant and full of life as any of you. Now I am stricken down. It should teach us all to be prepared. Captain Graham of the Rockbridge Artillery, coming near, said farewell. He said, Short Bell said, "Farewell, Captain. I have always tried to do my duty to my company and to my God, and if I have failed at any time, I hope I am forgiven." A few moments later, he asked Morrison Smith to pray for him, but he was suffering so severely that he was hardly able to participate in the prayer offered. After the prayer, he charged Johnny Brown to give his Bible to his father and tell him that he was always a dear father to him, also adding, bid all my friends farewell, and bid them to see me in heaven, and requested that his body should be taken to where his friends could get it. Shortly after, he was moved to a more sheltered place. After moving him, he spoke but little until he became unconscious. He charged Johnny to give his love to his father and tell him that he loved him dearly to his last, charging Johnny to also give his love to his cousin Lizzie. While enduring great pain and expressing how much he was suffering, he closed his eyes and offered in the form of a prayer, "Jesus, remove me of this pain, and then take me to live with thee forever and forever and forever." Soon after this, he became unconscious, lingering until about 7 o'clock when he died. Being unsuccessful in endeavoring to have his body carried to the rear, we dug a grave near the entrance of the fort and buried him about 9 o'clock, consigning his body to the soldier's grave with a brief prayer. Knowing Bob as well as I did, and witnessing his happy death, and offering the prayer at his grave, I felt like offering our thanks. Then that thou hast blessed our kind companion in taking him from this world of care, pain, and sorrow to usher him into the bright and happy world where pain and grief and death never come, but where joy and peace forever reign. May each of us that witness his death live and die as happy as he did, and join him in that bright, peaceful world where he such senses of pain and death never enter. Enclosed is a diagram of the fort and surroundings, designating the spot where we interred his remains. And that was written by buyers of his company. And the Bells would receive this letter as well as the Bible and the diary and hold on to those until they handed them over to the Savoy Museum, which is now the Shenandoah Valley Savoy Museum. And you can see Robert Sherrard Bell's diary and Bible that was returned to his family after his death. Those are on display at the museum. So they exhumed his body and brought it to Winchester, and he's now buried in the family plot in Mount Hebron. But that is just another description. And like we talked about earlier, happy deaths. Were soldiers happy when they died? And I think more or less, maybe not happy, but the comfortableness with knowing what's to come, and especially with these soldiers. And this could be a totally different topic of religion and faith when it comes to soldiers in battle. No matter what religion, how that prepared them for death and to, pass on to whatever they believe the other side was. So that's a story of Robert Sherrard Bell that I really like to tell to folks, because we don't have a picture of him. I don't know what he looked like, but this description given by his one of his comrades in his final moments can help you imagine a little bit more of what he would have been like.
Yeah, and I think that's a good way to sum it up. Is I think the comfortability with death then compared to now has something to do with religious beliefs of the soldiers at the time.
Yeah,
probably prepared them a little more than some folks today. And it's interesting that we've talked about so many artillery casualties here this evening, and I believe, if I remember correctly, what I had read was that artillery only accounted for 2% of casualties during the war. It wasn't a lot.
Yeah.
Whatever the case was, whether it was 2% or something higher than that, it wasn't anywhere close to what you would imagine for the amount of artillery that was expended during the war, and the role that it played in battle, the amount of casualties that it actually accounted for. And going off of that, yet another artillery casualty here, and this is the last one that I have to mention, is General Leonidas Polk in the West with General Johnston, as they're kind of facing off with Sherman's army. This was in the vicinity of Pine Mountain. It was Johnston, Polk, and Hardee they were in that vicinity. They were, I guess, on a reconnaissance, kind of scouting out, Sherman's position and lines and what have you. And they're out here. They kind of see them out on this hilltop, and federal sharpshooters are popping shots at them just to kind of keep them at bay, just let them know, yeah, we see you. And then Sherman himself had mentioned, and this is from the American Battlefield Trust, how saucy they are. Good vocabulary there. But Sherman had his artillery open fire on them just to, give them what they refer to as a salvo, from some 3-inch rifles, 5th Indiana Battery, and Battery E of the Pennsylvania Light Artillery. And they fired in the direction of these generals, probably not intending to really do any damage, just to disperse them. But sure enough, Polk takes one right through his left side and out his right side, clean through him, as you could imagine a shell would do. Just a clean pass through. And this is just something that's tough to think about. I mean, it's not something that you would want to imagine, but they referred to it. They said an artillery round came, either a solid shot or a shell, which struck Polk, entering his left side and passing through his body. The general fell dead, instantly killed. And General Johnston and Hardee huddled near him, saying, "My dear, dear friend." Hardee grieved. And then Johnston tearfully laid a hand on Polk's forehead, lamenting, "I would rather anything but this." And that's not something that's easy to see, I mean, in any event in war, let alone someone that was obviously a close friend, and someone that was on the staff of Johnston to be. It's just something that it's hard to put into words how that would impact somebody, let alone us discussing it 160 years later. You know what I mean?
Yeah, I think that's a good way to sum up this episode, and we appreciate you folks listening. And if you sat through this one and listened all the way through, we hope this was more of an educational, eye-opening experience and listen for you all. I think it's a good reminder every now and then to remember why we're so fascinated, and even when we do smile at times, and there's good moments when studying and the relationships made, and it's great to learn, and especially this war that created this amazing nation we know and love today. It's good to be reminded of what the what the cost was, and how gruesome and graphic oftentimes it was, and these beautiful landscapes and battlefields we preserve and go to today, and visit and get to run around and take pictures and take videos on and things like that. We get to enjoy them and educate ourselves, but it's good to often remember why, and just keep that in the back of your mind next time you visit these places. You're reading a book or you're watching an Air and Civil War Travels video. It's good to remember the true cost of this war, especially, if not all wars, but this war that creates this community amongst all of us, whether you're listening or not. I don't know how you'd know what I'm saying, but nonetheless, I think it's often good to reflect and remember, like I said, the cost of this war. So we hope we didn't squirm too many people out of their seats, and it was a good eye opener. We definitely enjoyed sipping on the Penelope this episode, and
great choice.
Yeah, it was a good choice of bourbon. Thanks, Chris. Shout out, Chris.
Shout out, Chris.
So we truly appreciate it. And if you all have stories that you know about or you've researched and found, we'd love to hear those. Send those our way, because these definitely are good eye-opening stories to tell folks, and it helps them remember the true cost and effect of what took place on these fields. So thank you all so much for listening, and
thank you.
Yeah, we'll catch you on the next one.
Thanks, guys.